Okay. Good evening, everyone. I'd like to call to order this session, do the gavel, of the Tacoma Park City Council. Will the clerk please call the roll?
Mayor Stewart.
Here.
Councilmember Kovar.
Here.
Councilmember DeBala.
Here.
Councilmember Costick.
Here.
Councilmember Siemens. Councilmember Smith.
Here.
Councilmember Searcy.
Here.
All right, terrific. Tonight is our first Monday evening special meeting of the City Council to dig into our budget. Tonight, we're doing the operating and community services budget, or section of the budget. We'll start tonight with public comments, if there are any public comments here in the auditorium, and then we'll go to public comments online. Any public comments here? Okay, seeing none, then we will go online. We had 3 people sign up for public comments online. The first is Mr. Paul Hubner.
Can you hear me now? Excuse me. I don't know what, Jesse, can you hear me?
Yes, Mr. Hubner, we can hear you. We can't see you, but we can hear you.
Jesse,
you
do you
go.
have me now?
Yes, you may start now, Mr. Hubner.
I apologize. I was on screen, but I didn't have any, I couldn't hear me or whatever. So at any rate, good evening. Paul Hubner, Ward 3. I am a politically engaged long-term resident of Tacoma Park. Like many neighbors, I helped build this community. We are part of the reason that Tacoma Park is recognized as a progressive and inclusive community and a place where you want to live. Now retired with a substantial portion of my income from Social Security, I would bear the burden of another $1,500 tax increase should you raise the tax rate as proposed to 56.97 cents. I've been a homeowner in Tacoma Park for over 30 years, but also lived here in a group house in the mid-70s. All 5 people living in that house were rank and file union activists, from laborers to letter carriers. One housemate, Judy Berry, became a legend in California environmental movement. After 9 years in the labor's union, I joined the Carpenters, where I became the financial secretary treasurer. I've always participated politically as part of my civic responsibility. Student anti-war movement, civil rights, women's rights, LGBTQ rights, all that. I attended an anti-Klan demonstration near a Chrysler plant in Delaware where there were cross burnings to picket them. I worked with the Union-backed Committee on Political Education and was elected a precinct chair in the Democratic Party. Many other Tacoma Park homeowners have done all these things and more. Like many of my neighbors, I have a long history of volunteer work. I was on the executive board of Christmas in April, DC. I started Labor for Habitat for the Carpenters Union. I worked with Rebuilding Together. Wolfgang Mergner drafted me to start the Small Home Repairs Committee for the Village of Tacoma Park. As a carpenter, I've also literally helped build and maintain this community. I built additions and renovations throughout Tacoma Park, and I've helped many of my neighbors make repairs to their old homes. This month, I have a bill for a $400 medical test and a $350 prescription cost bill. I donate 8 to 10% of my gross income to major charities, helping to support people in need, both in our local community and abroad. I'm a contributing member to campaigns of progressive candidates locally and nationally, but I have a 2005 pickup, and I wonder of the equity of being taxed for a new fleet of $65,000 police SUVs. I have a budget that I must balance in order to live within my means. I think we all have a right to require the council and the city to do the same. If you approve the proposed new tax rate, my city taxes will increase by nearly 10%, whereas my Social Security is only increased by 5.9%. Over 1/3 of Tacoma Park homeowners are over 65 years old, many on fixed incomes. Do you want to gentrify us out of town using a regressive property tax? What I ask this council and city manager to do is serve the residents first and balance the city budget. It is, after all, your job.
Thank you, Mr. Hubner. Next, we have Mr. David Navari. Please, sir. Ms. Navari, we can't hear you. I think you're on mute still.
Sorry. Nice to address the council again. It's been a while. When I looked at the draft budget, I was pretty surprised at the proposed tax rate, which was 9.7% above the constant yield rate. Furthermore, when I saw the way that the sentence in the summary described it as not a 3-cent increase, which it is, but a 3-cent investment. All of our taxes are investments, but when you make a sentence that says the 3-cent increase is an investment, it just seems to not have the transparency and clearness that our citizens deserve. So I was pretty disappointed with that. I thought we moved away from that kind of behavior with the last city manager. I looked at the really nice map you guys came up with, which shows the assessments, and I think that's a great tool. The average assessment on Sycamore Avenue is so high that it'll peg all of us at the 10% increase on average. So if I take the 9.7% proposed plus the 10%, and that's a third of my total taxes, plus the 10% assessment increase, our Sycamore tax increase using this proposal would be 13%, which all it takes is 3 years of that to increase by almost 50%. So this is extremely painful, especially coming out of COVID, where so many of us had reduced hours. A lot of people lost their jobs. A lot of businesses had reduced revenue. And then I read in this budget about all the bonuses and the raises and the COLAs. And there's such a disconnect between the bureaucracy that seems to just be so entitled and always wants to grow, and the people that are working so hard. I am just baffled. I've reached out to some of my neighbors that are on fixed incomes, and I don't see how they're going to do it. I guess we're just going to have to admit that they're going to be eventually just driven out of Tacoma Park, which is really sad. So again, I've had a couple of you in my home, the mayor and a couple different council members. And I'm just asking you to please take a look at this and think about the people that are working really hard to make money and make ends meet. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Navari. And our final speaker this evening is Pamela Megna.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Hi. Okay. Hi. Let me start this. Hi. Hi. Thank you for inviting residents to speak in this public forum. My name is Pam Megna. We have lived at 317 Lincoln Avenue in Tacoma Park since 1992. My husband and I are both retiring in 2023. We are not in favor of the city manager's proposal to increase the tax rate. Moreover, given the increase in assessments, we believe the tax rate should be falling to maintain the constant yield. We believe the mayor and the city council and the city manager's primary goal should be to ensure fiscal responsibility. And we do not believe that the proposed rate increase is fiscally responsible. Due to the limitations of what's available online, I can provide only a few figures summarizing how things have changed in Tacoma Park. over the last 30+ years that we have lived in Tacoma Park. You know, when we moved in 1992, the population, according to the 1990 census, was 16,700 people. I might say that Tacoma Park's population was at its highest in 1970. And for those that may not know this, at that point in time, a lot of the homes in Tacoma Park were subdivided into apartments and or rooming houses, including my own house. My house was basically a rooming house. And I still periodically get 9 pieces of mail from Verizon, even though this house has been a single family home since actually before 1990. So the population has really not grown since 1990. It's gone up a little bit and then gone down. In 2000, it was 17,299. In 2010, it was 16,715. In 2020, it was 17,629. And I know some people believe that's undercounting, may or may not be, but regardless, the population really hasn't grown that much. The size of the city government has increased. The FTEs have increased significantly. But if you look at the general fund in 2010, which was $23.1 million, in 2021 dollars, that would be $30.47 million. But the proposed general fund is $34.8 million. I did not have time to go through the budget, but I know the county has recently decided to give the city more funds for duplicative services, and the city received a huge windfall gain from the federal government due to COVID. So I really hope that the mayor, the city council, and the city manager just reconsider the proposed budget and do something more responsible. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I think that concludes all of our public comments this evening. And now I will turn it over to the city manager for the budget work session.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Good evening, Mayor and Council. Give me a second while we bring this up. There you go. Awesome. This evening, Mayor and members of council will be covering community services and our operating budget. And as I stated a few weeks ago, that we're planning for a strong and resilient future by investing in our community. And by investing in our community means investing in our operations, investing in our people that do the work that you and the community expect us to do day in, day out. And that means making critical investments. And part of those investments we'll be talking about tonight. I'll provide just a budget context. We'll go into some departmental overviews, and this evening we have members from each of our department heads from each of the departments that will provide a high-level overview of some of their fiscal year 23 budgets. We'll talk about some community services and give you some highlights from that, and then we'll end off with budget schedule before we open it up for Q&A. So this proposed fiscal year 23 budget is a maintenance of effort budget. The increases in the general fund generally reflect a return to pre-pandemic levels as opposed to an expansion of services or new programming. The ARPA fund provides some expansion of those services and new initiatives in fiscal year 23. To reduce the general fund expenditures, departments reduced their baseline budgets by $1 million in fiscal year 22. Fourth quarter, and another $2 million in the fiscal year 23 through a combination of a fiscal year 22 delayed hiring or project delays and resilience in fiscal year 23 on ARPA, speed camera fund, and cable grants as alternative funding sources. The departments were not allowed to enter any wish list items or new items in an effort to limit general fund expenditures. New budget requests from departments above the baseline were tracked outside the financial system and totaled around $3 million. The current proposed unassigned fund balance reserve amount is 2.8, or 10% of the general fund revenue. To meet the city's policy of 17%, as I provided a few weeks ago, the unassigned reserve level of 4.7 or 17% for fiscal year 23 is what we need to maintain to meet your city reserve policy. In the general fund, general government, which includes the division of the city manager's office, legislative, finance, legal services, IT, HR, and city clerk. For the city manager's office and legal services, we propose budget highlights of $70,000 for financial forecast consultant for long-term financial planning. Council has asked myself and staff to look at out years, not just fiscal year 23, but 24, 25, 26. This consultant will be able to come on board and provide the technical skills that we need to be able to do long-term planning, and that will provide council opportunity for more exact and better decisions on future budgets. We had no FTE changes. ARPA manager was added in the fiscal year 22 budget. The city attorney and labor attorney costs reduced by $127,000 as compared to the fiscal year 22 projected, and will require cost control based on higher legal services in the actuals in recent years, because we're depending more on the city attorney for services due to contracting and other reasons. Finance, in the finance department, I'll turn it over to our finance director, and she'll provide some high-level overviews of her department. Director Chung.
Good evening, Council, Mayor, City Manager. In the Finance Department for fiscal year 23, with the recommendation of the IT Department, our financial software will be upgraded to cloud, and the migration should be live in fiscal year 23. The cost increase is approximately $20,000 more than the current contract. The cost of the auditing service and the annual report preparation will increase by approximately $9,000 under the new contract. And we are currently sent out the RFP for the new contract for the auditing service. In personnel changes, the division FTE increased by 0.5 compared to fiscal year 22. The increase is attributed to the reduction of a half-time permanent position and replaced by a full-time ARPA-funded accounting assistant position. And that will begin in fiscal year 23. Thank you.
Thank you, Director Chung. As we move forward with more of our divisions in general government, the next, Director Smith for HR.
Good evening. Just 3 points of clarification for the Human Resources Department. First, most exciting point is the HRIS system that we are finalizing recommendations for within the next couple of weeks. That system is an all-inclusive, integral employee self-service almost, which will completely transform how every employee, as well as the department, interacts with that system. And that should completely replace both SuccessFactors and Kronos, as well as replacing the HR modules that are currently within Tyler. For personnel changes, last July during one of the budget amendments, previously we had an HR intern that was changed to a full-time HR coordinator position. So it appears that we moved up 1 FTE because the interns are not counted in the FTE count. And then for the budget reductions, we primarily reduced the amount of funding for paid advertising for recruitments. There is still money in there for some paid postings, but we reduced it by quite amount of money. So that They'll still be posted on the free job sites, but most of the association sites or higher level posting sites will not be able to be used for all the recruitments next year.
Thank you, Director Smith. Next division is the legislative division, and this accounts for council salaries and fringe benefits and expenses related to activities of council. For the mayor and council to be elected in November 2022, this fall, the annual salaries will increase to $32,000 for the mayor, $24,000 for each city council member. The board and committee member stipends will continue at $35,000. Non-personnel election costs are accounted for in this division. $78,000 is budgeted for November 8th, 2022 election, and other expenses include contractual lobbying services, meeting costs, and conferences that the council would be attending. Madam Clerk?
So the city clerk's budget is really a maintenance of effort budget. Just as a reminder, the major things that the city clerk's office does is handles city council meetings and activities, recruitment and appointments to boards and committees, administering city elections, and responding to requests under the Maryland Public Information Act. Our personnel count is 2.75, and that remains the same. The proposed budget does include funds for a full-time intern for 4 months to assist with the election. And just want to point out that personnel costs are 94% of the division budget.
Thank you, Madam Clerk. The next area we're going to go into division is IT.
Thank you, Jamal. Madam Mayor, City Council, nice to meet you all for the first time, my first time in person. I've watched you all through various sessions since I got here, but it's nice to see people face to face. Thank you for allowing me to provide some additional information about the IT budget this year. My first stab at it, so a little of leniency I might need. See how well I do. So as outlined, in summary, as outlined in the FY23 budget book, the overall IT budget has an increase of approximately 2% over last year. That's a total of $16,000 annually. The increases were split almost down the middle, about 50-50. There's about $8,000 in personnel cost increase and about $8,000 in our operating expenses. Just some fun facts or statistics that kind of drive what we do in IT is the stuff, as I always call it, that we support here for the city. We support over 1,000 devices. It may be kind of hard to believe. They have a small community center and a couple of outbuildings, but there are over 1,000 devices that are supported by the IT team, combinations of phones and computers and time clocks, et cetera, cameras, securities. There's a lot of moving parts and pieces, and our current team, including myself, is 4, and they support those 1,000 devices. We have over 50 applications that are a combination of applications that are hosted in the cloud, as well as applications that are either here on their respective desktops or hosted in our data center. And they support almost 2,400 tickets a year. That includes service requests for people saying, I need a new phone, something's broken, I want a new monitor. So lots of moving parts in the IT team here, even for a very small city. Some of the highlights that have kind of changed or caused some of the increase is our hardware and software applications. We have 50 of them plus. We constantly have upgrades to do and service support that we need from our vendors. So we make sure that we're included in the budget costs for those vendors to assist us, whether it be for upgrades or break-fix service, because you can imagine with those number of applications, we can't be experts in all of them, but we have a general foundational understanding of each one of them. Most of our software agreements, that's the other largest part of the expense budget, is the maintenance, software services, software maintenance agreements, and subscriptions. The majority of the lion's share are annual agreements, but we do have some of our larger agreements that come up for renewal every 3 years. Those, coincidentally, 2 of our large vendors are actually up for renewal this year for another 3-year agreement. So what we anticipate year over year, and as we put together a longer range forecast for our IT expenses, there will be ebbs and flows and spikes every few years. I would just get better competitive pricing by doing that every 3 years. Personnel changes, no FTE count increases this year. And the budget reductions that we put in place, again, because of the increases that we had for some of our upcoming contract renewals, we reduced some of our general fund projections or expenses by about $40,000. We went back to the drawing board on some of them and kind of value engineered them and tried to figure out ways we could enhance security. And one of our big drives is to move things to the cloud over time, so we can rely less on having to maintain and build a very, very expensive and robust security infrastructure on premise. The vendors, they get the economies of scale to be able to provide that to us when they provide us for services. So we're slowly but surely over a number of years will be migrating to that, and then we're starting to build some of that infrastructure as part of this calendar year or this fiscal year's budget. And we did actually remove some network resiliency out of the budget. We had a very, very probably, once in 100-year event where the lightning struck one of the facilities and actually took out all of our communications to the entire community center. We had originally put money to add resiliency for wireless connectivity. But we felt, in talking to the city manager, deputy city manager, said, what are the chances of that happening again? So with budget constraints, we decided to pull that out. So those are the highlights I have. And thank you. Nice meeting you all.
Thank you, Director Blazek. Council, we'll now turn to, so that ends general government. We'll now turn to public safety. And we'll have Deputy Chief Powell and Lieutenant Holmes. And they'll be covering the police budget as well as speed camera automated enforcement.
Good evening, and Madam Mayor, City Council members, Mr. Fox. So for the police department, our operating budget for FY23 is going to go up by 1%. Personnel costs are going to increase by 4%, but our other operational costs, non-personnel, will decrease by 46% for FY23. For our proposed budget highlights for FY23, the decrease is due to budget reduction measures. We've looked at everything line by line and tried to make reductions where we could. And also we've transferred several expenditures to the automated enforcement line, which is a speed camera line. Our proposed general fund FTE change is -3, with code enforcement returning to housing and community development. The impact of the budget reductions for FY22, we've also gone through our budget line by line and seen those items that haven't been spent yet, things that could be put off until next year, things that we didn't need right away. So we have made several cuts there. We have several vacancies in the department that are unlikely to be filled until FY23 in an effort to as a budget cutting measure. And again, for FY23, we're going to be moving some of those required expenditures to the automated enforcement section. Okay. For the speed camera automated enforcement section, that will necessitate a rather large increase. So our overall expenditures are going to increase by 74%. The personnel costs will increase by 11%. That is mainly attributable to the filling the vacant photo enforcement specialist position, which has been vacant for a little while now. For the non-personnel, so a bunch of highlights, non-personnel operating expenses, again, we're going to increase, and that's due to the transfer of several contract charges from other divisions as a budget reduction measure, and they're going to be supported by the addition of a new contract for red light cameras, which we're going to be adding to the city. And those are expected to result in increased revenue for the fund.
Thank you, Lieutenant Holmes. We'll now pivot towards Director Braithwaite and Public Works. and Director Braithwaite will cover her budget as well as the stormwater management.
Hi, good evening. As others have said, this FY23 proposed budget is a very lean maintenance of effort budget. Our non-personnel operating budget is lower than the FY22 by 21%. That's due to the elimination of our sustainability grant funding, which has been moved to the ARPA budget, and not replicating the allocation that was made by the council for the stormwater study in FY22. We do have some planned customer improvements. We're hoping to have all our permit applications available online through the GovQA portal, and that should hopefully be done before the end of this fiscal year. And then we did take a look at our revenue and are proposing some modest increases in revenue, which will generate slight increases in revenue. The permit and mulch delivery fees will be increased by $10 and heavy pickup by $5. It's currently $10 for 3 items. It'll move to $15. The FTEs are shown as an increase of 0.92. In reality, there is really no change in full-time equivalents. That change is as a result of, in our vegetation maintenance division, we previously had funding available for temporary staff that we brought in for a mowing assistant and for garden maintenance. And we'll be moving that instead to a seasonal staff position, which does count as an FTE. So you'll note in the budget book that the temporary assistant line for the vegetation maintenance division has been zeroed out for 23. There's a slight increase in the number of hours where our goal is to have 24 weeks for a mowing assistant, 24 weeks for garden maintenance. The FY22 reductions are largely vacant positions and delays in hiring for some specific departments, including building maintenance and vehicle maintenance, and reduced use of temporary assistants in our right-of-way division. We did have many items on the wish list that were not included in the budget, one of which was an internal work order system. So we've done our best to try to streamline both 22 as well as 23 budgets. I will note that our FTE equivalent is just a little over 38 staff, and that includes both stormwater as well as public works. The stormwater budget is broken out into 3 major sections. One is our repair and maintenance portion, which is about 24% of the budget, contractual services, which is about 25%, and capital expenditures, which represent the rest. Because of the cost of the project, our major capital project for FY23 will be the Tacoma Branch Stream Restoration. It's a project that we've had in design and development for quite some time and worked hard to try to find a grant funding source. We're unable to find it. We'd hoped to do it through ARPA money, but with that not able to be done, we're moved it to the capital budget for FY23. We do have several critical repair projects planned in the budget. Brashears Run Outfall, which is down at the Maple Avenue side of Sligo Creek. Continuing work on the Poplar Avenue inlet reconstruction and sidewalk elevation project. We're hoping to do the private property portion of that repair this year, and the rest of that needed work on that section of Poplar Avenue in FY22. And we have some known system repairs that we need to do on the system on Willow Avenue in Valley View. In terms of what we contract for, we do outfall water quality monitoring. It's a requirement from the state. We do system inspection and cleaning, about 1/5 of the stormwater system. We have about 17 miles of stormwater pipes. About 1/5 of that is videoed and cleaned each year. And the maintenance of our bioretention facilities, as well as specialized engineering support. There's no change in the stormwater budget in FTEs. No planned reductions in FY23. As you know, the stormwater budget we have a revenue from the utility, the stormwater utility fee, and balance those expenditures against the revenue annually. Thank you.
Thank you, Director Braithwaite. Now we're going to pivot to Recreation Department and Director Clark.
Good evening, Mayor and Council. For the Recreation Department, our budget includes the Administrative Division, Youth Outreach Division, Tacoma Park Recreation Center, Community Programs, which is our sports, trips, and special events, athletic fields and facilities, camps, before and after care, and the Tacoma Park Community Center programs that take place here. For our FY23 budget is really a maintenance of effort budget. However, we do anticipate several increases in participation. For example, our camps are returning to the camps that we actually run are returning to pre-pandemic levels. Our morning and afternoon edition programs are returning to pre-pandemic levels, and our sports programs for FY23 are returning to pre-pandemic levels. And to give you an example of a sports program, our winter basketball program, for example, usually has between 750 to 800 kids participants pre-pandemic. And this past year, we reduced that number to about 600 to make sure we had enough time for people to transition in and out the gym and can be cleaned and that sort of things for all the facilities that we were using. Our personnel changes, the department FTEs increased by 1.72 compared to FY22. 1.22 of those FTEs is due to the return of pre-pandemic programming. So we're returning our levels of programming. And also, we during the pandemic, we shared an employee with the finance department, and that person is actually coming back to the recreation department full time. All right, that's it.
Thank you, Director Clark. We'll have Director Cross provide the highlights in his fiscal year 23 budget, from housing and community development.
Good evening, Madam Mayor, members of council. Tonight we'll talk a little bit about the housing and community development budget. Just want to set the stage. HCD has the following divisions. We touch about almost every part of life in Tacoma Park: the administrative division, economic development, arts and humanities, planning and development services, housing and community services, and new in FY23 is code enforcement. HCD's budget improves the quality of life in the city through supporting economic development in small businesses, assisting tenants, and addressing resolving issues between tenants and landlords, enhancing the city's bus shelter, bicycle network, and other infrastructure, public art installations, cultural exhibits, and lectures, and new in FY23 is the inspection of commercial, residential, and vacant properties. Our personnel changes are increasing by 3. Our FTEs are increasing by 3 this year to accommodate code enforcement. This year, we have some highlights for you. The Smart Sheet software we are implementing this year and continuing into next year, which is helping to improve project tracking and increasing productivity. We have service contracts with OTBA and Tacoma Langley Crossroads Development Authority for economic development, and new in FY23 is Crossroads Community Kitchen service contract and the Long Branch Business League to assist in covering all of the businesses in the city. We also have a contract with the Montgomery County DHCA for rental inspection services. We provide funding for honorarias for performers, film screenings, lectures, and the Poet Laureate. We will be completing the public space management plan in FY23, which will provide the city with a much needed policy and framework for how to utilize our public spaces. We'll continue to fund the rental licensing and rent stabilization software and database to ensure that our tenants have the protections that they need. And we also have vehicle leases for the code enforcement division. Our budget reductions were mostly mitigated. The impact was mitigated because we were able to transfer a lot of the funds to ARPA eligible dollars in place of using general fund dollars. Thank you.
Thank you, Director Cross. We'll now hear from Ms. Wright, Communications Department.
Good evening, Mayor, City Council, City Manager Fox. Thank you for having me to review our FY23 highlights in the Communications Department. First up is the website annual maintenance and 311 functionality total for $26,900. We're getting very close to picking a vendor for the new website in the fiscal year 2022. The new website will be a fully managed platform that informs and empowers our residents. The website will have an annual maintenance plus a 311 functionality. The annual maintenance will include hosting, updates, security, live help with troubleshooting and functionality, as well as on-demand videos. The 311 will be a modern solution that accepts, routes, and manages public service requests. It contains a mobile app and web tool that allows residents to report issues on the go. Our auditorium hybrid meeting AV integration for $20,000 will help to integrate production to the auditorium AV infrastructure. As the hybrid meetings are a way of the future, our production team is currently operating under 3 different locations in our community center. This will also help with issues with delay between audio and video. For our FTE, we have no changes or additions. And the impact of our budget reduction, the communication department has moved approximately $70,678 of general funds into the cable grant fund. This move includes Adobe Cloud, which is a licensing for all of our city employees, contracts such as cable grants, Comcast cable, and also operating supplies. This is a short-term funding source, however, as cable revenue is expected to decrease over time due to lower cable subscriptions. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Ms. Wright. And Director Jones will share a budget with the library.
Good evening, Council and Mayor. As other departments have stated, our budget is really one of maintenance. And as you know, we're anticipating a busy fiscal year 23. This budget was developed with all the scenarios that might entail in mind. So to that end, there are 2 primary areas in which we are requesting some small increases. The first is additional funds to cover book purchases and online reference services for all ages. Pre-COVID, each of these line items ran about $40,000, and with a balanced budget in mind, we're not requesting that full amount back, but we do need more than fiscal year 22 to ensure that we are able to keep up with new releases, replace popular titles, and provide comprehensive online database access services for residents. As part of serving as an independent neighborhood library, we also need to ensure that our selection of books reflects our community, and we need to improve our world languages collections, especially in Spanish, French, and Amharic. The second area is we're also requesting a few more hours for part-time staff and supplemental assistance or substitute help. The FTE increase does not reflect new personnel, but additional hours for existing staff. And while we would prefer the library and computer center's relocation during construction to be at one central point, if the library and computer center have to decentralize, we will need to staff at least 2 more desks than we are currently staffing. With regards to the impact of budget reductions, as you can see here, the primary impact for us was we tabled the implementation of a new discovery layer to our online catalog. And while that has been shelved indefinitely, we're going to continue to seek funding opportunities to bring that to Takoma Park outside of the general fund, since we believe it would make using our online resources more intuitive, which is an important aspect of accessibility and bridging the digital divide. So we will also be discontinuing a few database subscriptions that are not often accessed, but we will still have a comprehensive selection of services that residents can utilize with their Takoma Park, Maryland library cards. And with that, I yield.
Thank you, Director Jones. So Council, this evening you heard from each of the department heads providing their departmental highlights, and the key thing you kept hearing, maintenance of effort. Maintenance of effort. That's most of how collaboratively we built this budget for fiscal year 23. As I shared a couple weeks ago, because of your efforts, we were able to invest a little over $13.1 million into the community, $4.4 million in city operations, but $13.1 million to the community. We'll be providing more updates to council as we go along in these different key areas. We've already provided social services partnerships over the last several weeks. And for the rest of the resiliency programming and community anchors will be forthcoming as we get into the summer. But I just want to highlight some of the investments again that I shared last time. The key piece about how we actually leverage some of the ARPA funding. So several of these community investment programs, which would typically be funded in general fund, we are now covering it by the ARPA fund, and we reflected that in the budget book for those general fund reductions concentrated on interdepartmental section. But in the community, as shared previously, $5,000 going to Montgomery College scholarships, $150,000 property tax and renter rebate programming, Public Works emergency tree removal for $35,000, $10,000 for community play, $20,000 for Independence Day committee, $45,000 for lunch and learn, $103,500 for those service contracts that Director Cross spoke about shortly ago. And then when we look at our special revenue section, $200,000 for Tacoma Park Cooperative Nursery School Grant, $175,000 for Washington McLaughlin School Grant, $273,000 CDBG Neighborhood Improvements, $312,000 for New Hampshire Ave Bikeways, $120,000 for Safe Routes to Schools and TKPK Challenge, $145,000 for Recreation Center redevelopment, $500,000 for Affordable Homeownership Grant, and $500,000 for 6530 and 6600 New Hampshire Ave revitalization. That concludes the highlights of our community service investments that, if this budget is approved, that you guys will be approving for the community. Just want to highlight our budget schedule moving forward. This evening, we have the budget work session over community services and operating department of budgets. Next week, we'll take a deep dive into the CIP on April 25th. And then on April 27th, on that Wednesday, we'll have the public hearing on the budget and the tax rate for fiscal year 23. And then, of course, moving forward to May 2nd, you have the budget reconciliation for our third work session for this budget year. And then the first reading on May 11th, second reading on May 18th, and then we'll be providing the tax rate submitted to the state and county on the Thursday the 19th. With that, Madam Mayor, turn it back over to you and members of council for any questions of myself or any department heads.
Great. Thank you very much for that presentation. Let's see if any of my colleagues want to kick us off tonight. Councilwoman Searcy.
Well, thank you all for all of your presentations and all of the hard work that you all put in every day. We really appreciate all that you do. So a couple just quick questions just to, kind of as a bit of a sanity check for me. The software update and the new systems that we're using in terms of project management, some of the HR stuff, some of the finance stuff, those were funded using ARPA dollars. Is that correct? Like that first year's monies? I recall we did an initial tranche of software, HR related operational software that was, I thought was a part of some of those early ARPA dollars, but I could be wrong about that.
Sure. So we do have $164,000 budgeted for the financial system software upgrade. We've actually kicked that out to fiscal year 2024. Speaking further with Director Chung, we don't think we have the capacity to do the HR system and the financial system upgrade in one fiscal year. So, but there is ARPA funding for the financial system. What Director Smith was talking about is the HRIS system upgrade, which we currently have two different HR systems, one for kind of payroll functions and one for performance evaluations and recruiting. We'd like to eliminate those and combine them into one HRIS system.
Okay. Yeah. And that was not a part of the original?
Correct. That is general funds for that.
Okay.
And that was approved last July.
Okay. And then on the last slide, there was a rec center, yes, there was a rec center redevelopment of $145K. How does that relate to the ARPA dollars that I thought we had included for rec-related activities?
Director Cross, will you speak to that?
So the $145,000 for rec center redevelopment that is in the special revenue funds, that is a NED grant that is for architectural and engineering design funds that we applied for last year. That is slightly different than the ARPA funds, which we have said can be utilized for either current repairs to the rec center while it's in transition to redevelopment, and or part of that capital stack for when we do the redevelopment of the rec center, no matter what form that is, design or construction, it'll be an additional part of that project funding.
Okay. And so for the net grant, do we need a match?
No.
No. Okay. Okay. Thank you.
Thanks.
Councilmember Kovar.
Thank you. Thank you for all the information, and thanks to the staff for the presentations. And to me, well, I'll make a few general comments, and then depending on what my colleagues want to say, I can ask some specific questions now or later. I think most of the programs that the staff are talking about on their face seem meritorious, but I do have a concern about the impact of the tax rate, as we talked about in the previous meeting. And I think that at least one or two of the public commenters made reference to the impact of the assessments. And I think we have the problem that we've had in the past, which is that the trend of the increases is not evenly distributed around the city and seems somewhat random in certain ways. And I've talked to people who have seen really substantial increases, and some on my block, and then some on my same block and elsewhere who have had no increase in the assessment. So it's hard to really get a fix on what that is, but or what the reason for that is, and that's something that the state office is in charge of ultimately. But for a lot of people, even if they're not seeing an increase in their assessment, the impact of the 3 cents per $100 of assessed value would be pretty substantial to begin with, and then for those who got a bigger assessment, it's larger. So I do intend to explore ways of finding some cuts that could potentially reduce the proposed rate, and we'll get into that going forward. I think to some extent probably there's more opportunity to do that in the capital budget, which I think we're talking about in the next Monday session as opposed to tonight. But in operations, I think there also is a question. And one of the things that was unclear to me, we also have this budget amendment on the schedule for discussion next week, and maybe the city manager could just say a word or two about that, because what isn't clear to me is that I think the net impact of the changes in that budget amendment is $935,000 in reductions, not counting the library funds, which are just being put over to the next fiscal year, assuming that project continues to move forward. But what wasn't clear to me, and maybe you can shed some light on this now or subsequently, is are the expenditures that would have been made in the current fiscal year 2022, which are being pulled out from that through that budget amendment that we'll be taking up next week, or on Wednesday rather, are those expenditures that will just be moved to the next fiscal year, or are they reductions that are not being picked up subsequently? And I apologize if that was a long wandering question, but maybe maybe you can respond to that if you catch my drift.
So most of the items that are part of the Fourth Amendment are reductions in fiscal year 22, the ones that we will not be spending. There may be a few, I don't have it in front of me, maybe a few that may be rolling over because some of the projects may not be fully expended this year and needs to carry over, but for the most part, it's the reduction exercise that we went through as staff, reducing fiscal year 22.
So if those funds in that category aren't spent, they aren't just picked up again in the next fiscal year, what happens to that money? So in other words, does that remain in the unassigned balance? Does that get rolled into available funds next year for other purposes? Is it meaningful to even say what happens to that money because everything's fungible? But what does happen with that money?
If it would, any money unspent, it would, when we balance everything out, would go to the general fund unassigned. And that's
Okay.
where it would be.
Okay. So money's in next week's, I keep saying next week, Wednesday's, the amendment we're talking about on Wednesday, if it's just being cut and not just shifted to next fiscal year, in theory, that's part of the general group of funds that's available for next year and could be in the unassigned balance depending on what else we do. Is that sort of what you're saying? I'm not trying to put words in your mouth, but that the funds that we don't spend and that we don't move into next fiscal year either, they're still there, right? And they're just available for other purposes, is that? They don't disappear, right? We just don't spend them, but we still have them. Okay. So the other thing that I'm a little bit unclear on is, and then I'll stop and let my colleagues ask questions. We talked about it a little bit before, and I submitted a written question about that earlier today, and you and this other staff may not have had a chance to look at it yet, but the unassigned balance was at 28%, and then it's projected to be at 17% at the end of this fiscal year, June 30th, but then when we get into fiscal year 23, be down to more like 10%. So what are the factors that contribute to that change? Because the thing I'm having a hard time with is if there's all the maintenance of effort budgets with a handful of modest increases here and there, it's not clear to me what's driving the need to increase the property tax rate by the level you're proposing that it be increased by.
Yeah, so when you look at the unassigned level at the end of fiscal year 21, it equaled 28% of the general fund revenue. We projected to show a 17.9% level at the end of fiscal year 22. One of the factors of the lower percentage level in the reserve in fiscal year 22 as compared to fiscal year 21 is connected to the higher than anticipated personnel cost. As indicated from the general fund summary that we provided in the budget book. The increase of the expenditure from the audited fiscal year 21 to the projected fiscal year 22 is the $3.8 million that you see in the budget book, and the increase in revenue is $1.9 million. The deficit of $2.9 million is mainly drawn on the unassigned for fiscal year 22.
And so part of the personnel cost increases that you're talking about, that was connected to the higher rate of inflation we saw and the lump sum payments that were provided to the staff connected to COVID and so on that we did in the most recent negotiation. Is that right? Okay. And then the one other question I had, then I really will stop for a minute. It looked like in reading the budget document that our expected increase in income tax funds for the coming year would be $171,000 and change. And I did notice when we heard from Council President Albornoz the other night, I didn't hear in person because I was still out on my COVID time away. He was saying that they had a substantial increase in income tax receipts. I don't think he cited the number. Just because the county as a whole doesn't mean we do, because ours is based on what happens here in the city. But the 171,000 struck me as fairly low, all things considered. And is that just a number that the county gives us? Is that what that represents?
Yeah.
Yes, it does. And I don't know, Director Chung, would you want to expound on that?
The income tax receipt is always fluctuating, and it fluctuates from year to year. So our estimate for fiscal year '23 is basically based on the current year receipt, how much we receive, and we factor in some increases that might be happening in the next year. And I usually have a spreadsheet to calculate what is the amount that we're going to receive next year. But that amount is just our estimate. The actual receipt amount won't be able to tell at the end of the fiscal year. So I don't know if I answer your question.
Well, I guess, so my question would just be, how do we calculate that? Is there just some sort of percentage increase that we attribute to it and hope that it?
Yeah,
maybe
the
would be close to
percentage increase is based on the average 10-year amount. We have a long spreadsheet that calculates what is the average 10-year increase, and we use that percentage to plug it into the fiscal year '23. But this is always an estimate because the income tax receipt usually fluctuate from one year to another. Last year increase doesn't mean that we're going to have an increase on next year. Especially the last 2 years, we have the effect of the COVID, so the revenue income from the income tax may not be the same.
Mm-hmm. Okay. All right. Thank you.
Thank you.
Councilman DeBala.
Thank you. I have a lot of specific questions, but I want to hit just a few general points tonight. So the first one is, I think that I didn't quite follow which of the community grant programs and community grant categories you're suggesting will come from ARPA and which ones will come from general fund. And maybe that's a question you just get back to us on, but I think, at least for me, and this goes to my second question, I'm not sure that I was thinking of the ARPA money in general as a substitute for programs we have now. So my second question has to do with that. Y'all sent us a table with a bunch of, with a list of ARPA-related funds that are not in the general fund, different categories. And the one that jumped out at me, because it was the biggest by far, was the sustainability grant. So for example, I thought that we had discussed that would be much more targeted and coordinated with the housing funds, with the multifamily funds, than a normal year would be. And now we come to find there's zero, almost zero, in the regular budget beyond what we had put for ARPA for this more specialized purpose. And I'm guessing that might be true for some of the other categories. So my second question is that. How closely are the programs aligned? Because I'm not sure that they all are. Between the ones that you've got now on the ARPA list that you took out of the general fund, and that were in the general fund for the past few years. And my third question, give me a minute. Speaking of property taxes, just to let everybody know, we have been working with Director Cross and his staff, well, with Dan, I guess it's not his staff. Anyway, the point being, we have got some rough estimates of who might be missing in that pool of folks. And to make a long story short, again, math not being my strong point, but I did a few back of the envelope calculations, and I will probably be suggesting that we add a little bit into that property tax credit line on page, it's toward the end, to address picking up a few people that are not covered now. I would also like to let everybody know that I got notes from a couple residents saying that their county tax deferral expires this year. So this will be a year that they will not get, for the first time in 5 years, a break on their county taxes. So I think following up on that with the county to see if they will extend that, if they're planning to extend that program, is really pretty important to find out. And if not, how we're gonna cope, how we're gonna cover with that. I think that's it for me for now. And I want to thank all the staff, the staff that came tonight, because I really appreciate it. I don't think everybody wants to hear all my specific questions for all of you, so I'll just try to do it by email. But I really appreciate you coming out and giving us the overview.
Thank you. Councilman Costa.
Thank you, and want to reiterate my thanks also to all of you who came out to give the presentations tonight, and to Mr. Fox and Ms. Clark for all of your work on the budget. And it's always useful, I think, beyond just making the budget decisions, to hear what's going on in each of the departments. So thank you all for giving us the overview as well. One of the things I had sent in my long list of questions, and I appreciate you all going through the questions I had sent to date, was just trying to wrap my head around the staffing numbers, and both trying to figure out where we are now and how that compares with where we were, I guess, back in FY19, when we had our last sort of quote unquote normal year. So is it possible to just get sort of a summary of the staffing changes we have now, and how that relates to kind of where we are with this budget, and some of the increases that seem to be taking us back to pre-pandemic numbers in some of the departments, like in recreation, for example, but that our total numbers of FTEs are also higher than they were in FY19. So I'm just trying to wrap my head around that and wonder if we could just get sort of a summary on that.
I don't know if Director Smith wants to provide some comments to that, but as far as for fiscal year 23, the 6.65 FTE, so we're looking at, for general government, there's one FTE increase for the human resources position, which is a full-time replacement for an intern position, 0.5 FTE decrease for finance. There's a 0.92 seasonal position for public works that existed but wasn't counted in fiscal year 22. That's increase of hours, and that's it coincides with what Director Braithwaite presented tonight. The 1.72, which is the what Director Clark presented tonight, 1.22 FTE due to a return to pre-pandemic, as well as the 0.5 transfer from the finance department for the FTE back there. For the library department's increase in supplemental assistance, as Director Jones presented tonight. And then you had the 3 FTEs for ARPA that you all had already approved back in July. Director Smith, could you share, as far as going back to 19, because that takes it from 171 to 171.78 or something like that, but could you add some levity on that?
Yeah, I'll have to get back to you with specific details, especially going back to 2019. But just off the top of my head, I think the biggest change, not from 19 till now, but certainly over the last 3 years, the difference is going to be not an actual full-time body, but hours that are used in rec, and library has stayed mostly consistent, but rec, library, communications with the AV folks. Any increase in their hours adds to the FTE count. So specifically in rec, over the last couple of years where the programs have decreased, the FTE count should have also increased, because the hours of the pooled positions where they have a lot of the high school and college kids that fill in on random schedules for their camps or programs or things like that. Those hours as a total are built into the FTE count. So it's not one person, but it's 20 people making up a half of an FTE, if that makes sense. So the majority of changes year to year are going to be shifting in those pooled positions where it's a group of people making up additional hours for programming or things like that. That's, again, off the top of my head. I'll have to go back and verify. I don't remember any major additions to actual body count, if that makes sense, other than shifts and hours. But I can certainly get back to you on that.
Yeah, that's really helpful. And I actually think if we could get some type of summary on those, the numbers that you're describing where it is just additional hours, because I feel like in each budget that we go through, we have that, and it looks like the total numbers are increasing, and it's often very hard because it's just, you know, a 0.1 here and a 0.3 there, and how does that really add up? So
Correct.
if there's some sort of summary we could get on that, I think that would be tremendously helpful. Thank you. I guess just building on that, one of my more specific questions was, I think earlier in the process related to rec, we had talked about maybe the camps needing to be smaller in size because of the community center renovation, or the community center renovation and the library work. It sounds like maybe that's not the case now. So just curious what your plans are for the summer camps.
Yes, for our summer camps, we are, as I stated earlier, we are increasing the number of young people that are allowed in the camps that we actually run. So those numbers are going up in our general recreation camps. One of the things that we aren't doing this year is having our specialty camps that are run by outside contractors. The outside contractor camps usually don't take recreation staff. They actually staff them themselves, but because of all of the regulations and things that we have to go through, we would actually have to train each contractor in order how to run their camp and go through the procedures and processes and those sorts of things. So our camp participants are increasing, and there are state regulations of how many campers you have to how many staff. So those numbers are increasing with the number of people.
Okay. Well, it's great to hear that there will be still be robust camps this summer.
That's also taking place with our aftercare as well. We're increasing the number in our aftercare program, so the number of staff that we actually have to have increases as well.
Okay. All right. Thank you. I appreciate it. And then I guess my other more specific question is with regard to the speed camera fund and the balance there. I don't have the specific number in front of me here, but just looking at the increase in revenue that we're anticipating for the speed camera fund based on those new red light cameras, it seems like we're leaving a lot sort of in our general reserve, not our general reserve, but our speed camera reserve at the end of the year. I think it was over $1 million or 1.5 million, if I remember correctly. And I'm just curious if some of that, sort of what the thinking is behind that, is some of that funds that could be shifted over to utilize for some other purpose where we could free up some general funds, or is there a specific reason why those are remaining in the special revenue fund or in the speed camera fund?
Well, most of the speed camera fund is restricted for law enforcement and public safety related items. And Deputy Chief, did you want to speak to that?
Yeah, what the city manager said is absolutely correct. It's restricted under state law about what it can be used for. Also, we have to be very careful because this is a fund that is not going to be consistent with revenue flow each year. So we don't want to attribute an exorbitant amount of those funds to essential services because we don't know when the law would change. We don't know what are the things that would impact the fund itself. So we have to be very conservative with the spending of it and what we attribute essential services or essential projects to it. So we're trying to be very conservative in what we use it for.
So if we find that we are getting a consistent amount that is above what we've had before, are there expenditures that we can utilize that for? I mean, I understand it's restricted, but are there some other things that could be, that are within the allowable expenses that we could shift some funds around to utilize it for in the future?
We have done that, and I'm going to ask Lieutenant Holmes to step to the podium, and she can speak to some of the things that we moved over to the speed camera fund.
And as Deputy Chief Powell said, the one thing we don't want to do is we don't want to try and rely on the speed camera fund or the photo enforcement funds for things that are usually general fund expenditures. Because as he said, the law could change. The legislature could change the speed camera law tomorrow and we have no more speed cameras, and then we have those funds. So you don't want to rely on having those funds year to year for certain expenses. And then those funds either go down based on a slight change of law, or they can go away. As you know, there are a lot of people that are not in favor of speed cameras. So that is something we have to worry about. But as for FY23, we did shift some expenditures over to the speed camera fund. And those related to a lot of the contractual expenditures. Let's see. A second here, I can get to you. Some of the things that we moved over to the speed camera fund are our conferences and conventions, which are law enforcement related, our training, our ammunition and firearms training and purchases, our parking meter collection, the parking citation processing. Let's see. Some of our other costs that we switched over are costs for the departmental cell phones, radios, some of the costs associated with our mobile data terminals. Some of the software items we use, like the language line, the tip line. There are a couple other items. Lights On traffic safety program is a new program that we're going to be doing next year, which is a program to assist residents when they receive a repair order from one of our officers and may not have the funds to fix their light bulbs, change light bulbs, fix a light. So that's a special program that we're going to be starting next year, and that is also going to be coming out of the speed camera fund. So those are the major items that are going to be transferred from our regular lines to the speed camera fund line.
Thank you. Yeah, that's helpful. I'm just looking at that and thinking, I understand we might not want to make a permanent plan to use those funds for other things, but just thinking as we look at a potential tax increase of a couple of cents, are there ways that maybe we could shift some of those in the short term to cover some things that are needed in the general fund? So I appreciate you sharing that. I know it is restricted in terms of what it can do, and it sounds like it is. We're going to be able to utilize it for a number of good projects, which is great. Thank you.
Councilman Coffey, can I just ask a follow-up to that? Well, Officer Holmes, can we use some of those monies for sidewalks? Since it's a safety issue?
Deputy Chief, I know there's something having to do with that. Do you have the exact? I don't have the exact.
Yes, if it's a public safety project, it can be used for things such as sidewalks, on which you're speaking of. Again, I just stress that you have to take in consideration that we don't overestimate what we think those funds are going to bring in. The whole point, again, of the automated enforcement is to correct driver behavior. As driver behavior begins to correct, oftentimes those funds begin to decrease, as well as if you remember, we just redid our speed camera contract about a year and a half ago. We now have all those cameras online that actually have a higher ability to track. So we are getting more violations coming in at this time, but we expect that to change driver behavior. And we think that, over the next year or so, that those amounts are going to decrease again. So I would just say, I just want you guys to please keep that in mind, that the fund can always decrease. It's not going to be something that's going to stay steady, because our job with this is basically to put ourselves out of business.
And as
Right,
you-
no, I completely
Yeah.
understand that, and that's one of the reasons I was actually thinking instead of funding like something that we have to do on an ongoing basis, I think some of the ones that Officer Holmes pointed out were things that were on an ongoing basis is sidewalks are kind of, we do it and it's done, hopefully until long after we're not here anymore. But so anyway, thank you for that.
Yeah, and last thing on the speed cameras is if we do end up keeping, I hope we will, the four-way stop at Lincoln and Carroll, I think it might be useful to look at that location of the speed camera on Carroll Avenue as well, because I'm imagining more of the cars are going to be reducing their speed right at that location as they come up to the stop sign. So it might be useful to look at that camera and see if you have a reduction in tickets there.
Right, and that's something that they're always looking at. They're always looking at all the different locations and seeing how they're doing, seeing if anything needs to be changed or moved. But yeah, I do anticipate with that four-way stop, assuming that it is made permanent, that could cause a decrease in the violations at that location.
Great, thank you.
Councilmember Clover?
Oh, I had some additional questions, but I didn't want to jump in front of anybody else, so. Okay. Well, just to follow up on what the mayor said, because I was thinking the same thing, using funds that are generated from the speed camera for one-time expenditures and not just sidewalks, but I think there are some intersections in our streets, not in state highway controlled areas, but in our streets where the intersections themselves aren't safe. And maybe using those funds for fixing an unsafe intersection, then it's fixed. And then later on, and I appreciate the deputy chief's point that we don't know whether we'll have the money long-term, but using it over time for specific discrete projects strikes me as a good idea. So I just want to join with the mayor on that. Just a few other questions on the same topic. So the automated enforcement, there was reference to the increase in personnel costs. Now, did the increase in personnel costs also come out of the enforcement receipts, if that's the right word, or the funds that are realized from the enforcement? Or is the personnel paid for through the regular budget? If I have any other questions, I'll ask you right now, so you don't have to keep walking back. Yeah.
Exactly. So we have three positions that are paid for through the speed camera fund. We have a sergeant, we have a corporal, and then we have the photo enforcement specialist, which is a civilian position. Right now, that position is vacant. Our last photo enforcement specialist was forced to resign.
Okay.
So that position is vacant. So that's why we've seen a decrease in the end of the FY22 budget numbers for the personnel for that.
But that increase,
Right, but the
when the new
increase,
person is hired, is coming out of the funds that are raised from enforcement. not
it
from the
all
reg-
comes out of the
Yeah,
speed camera
okay.
fund.
So it's not,
All three of those positions are
Okay.
paid for by the speed camera fund.
I just wanted to confirm that.
Yep.
And that is the only other question I had about policing, so thank you, sorry.
Okay, no problem.
And just if I could ask with regard to stormwater, and I don't know whether the city manager.
Yeah, you can get
Oh,
your
I'm
steps
so- I'm
in,
sorry.
or you can,
Go ahead, go ahead.
again, maybe there aren't answers right tonight, maybe you need to get back to me, but I am curious. It's because of the pandemic, it's kind of hard to look just at 2 years for overtime trends with police. And I've asked several years in a row, how are the overtime trends going? But this time, I think it just needs to be backed up a little further because of the pandemic. But I would be interested in that, because I know a long-term goal of the police chief was to try to reduce the overtime, fully staff, and then reduce the overtime. So I'm just curious how that.
Right, and obviously
is working
overtime
out.
is hurt by a lot of different factors.
Yes, yes.
By budget, by manpower shortages. Obviously, when we're short of manpower, those positions still have to be filled. Those slots have to be filled on a shift. If anybody ends up calling out sick, then you have a shortage, even more of a shortage. So those get filled by overtime. The one thing obviously that went down during the pandemic was the court overtime because
Yes, I
the
noticed
courts were
that.
closed.
Yeah.
So it is hard to kind of compare these couple of years here just because of the pandemic really affected a lot of things.
I'll be interested when you double back what your assumptions are going for fiscal 23. I mean, I realize it's a bit of a, who knows, but I'd be interested what your assumptions are for budgeting on that. And then I got a little confused about the zeroing out of the state police rebate. I followed the explanation, thank you for giving it, about all the different categories of in lieu funds at the county level. But I noticed that the state police rebate appears to be zero, page 79. And I'm not sure what that is. So in the department revenue, there's all the in lieu ofs, which are the county, municipal infractions, parking permits, all that. Then we have police protection, state, and then police rebate zero. And is that the in lieu of police is above? So what's that? You see what I'm looking at?
I do. I didn't prepare those numbers. I think that comes
yeah,
through
okay, well,
finance.
Yeah,
Maybe
I
someone
can
can-
actually speak to that, Councilmember
you.
Naballo. That
Okay.
was part of the tax duplication negotiation.
Okay,
So
thank you.
you'll
So
see
that's a
that
county line.
the significant in lieu of police increase is really they're now showing they eliminated the police rebate, but are giving us the
A bigger in
combined
lieu, yeah.
amount as
Okay.
an in lieu payment now, because it used to be there were two different sections of the county code, that one that spoke to the rebate and then one that spoke to tax duplication, and it's all been consolidated as part of the recent negotiations.
Okay, thank you
Yeah.
for, I don't know why I thought that was a second state category. Thank you for explaining that. Councilmember Kovar, did you have a
Yeah,
question?
just three other questions. So one relating to stormwater, and I don't know whether city manager would like to handle that or Ms. Braithwaite, but if I understood correctly, the funding that had been approved in the current year budget for the outside contractor study of citywide stormwater analysis for the moment is pulled from this budget. Is that right? Or did I
It's
miss?
still
miss-
expected to be expended in this fiscal year. If we
Okay.
don't, then we'll do a budget amendment at the beginning of next
Okay.
year to not lose those funds,
Okay,
but.
so we
continue
still
the
have, we
intent
still
of
have
work.
that at the moment. Okay.
Yes.
And then the Tacoma branch restoration,
That's a capital project. in
and
the
that's a
stormwater.
regular capital part, not an ARPA one in the
Right,
end, right? Although
right.
it was initially looked at as a potential.
Yes.
ARPA. Okay. And then just two other things, and I think maybe the city manager could respond. One, the financial forecasting contract, can you explain what that is? Because I'm not sure I understand what it is.
Yeah, so with the contract is, it's no different than if you look at like the city auditor that we have come in and do our audit each year. The consultant will come in and work with the finance team and city management to dig in and try to model 3 to 4, normally I do 5 to 10 years out, for us to be able to see what potential revenues, what potential deficits we may be looking at on the horizon over a period of time.
Okay. And then the last one.
Or are you moving? Because that was one of my
Oh, yeah.
questions.
Well, go
I
ahead,
was
and
just-
then I'll ask my
So,
last one
yeah,
after.
no, I was just curious. So is that's just for consulting for like one project, to give them, they're going to come in and do one. I guess it seemed a bit high, and I was just wondering if we could get more information about over as we're talking
Yeah.
about the service. $70,000 seemed a bit high for that type of
That's just
service.
an estimate because we don't know what it would actually cost
Mhm.
until we actually put it out and have folks respond to it.
But I'm just wondering if somebody like MML or ICMA, other municipalities that have done this work, if we could get an estimate from them, possibly. It seemed a bit high, that's all. So I'm just wondering if we might be able to. Councilmember Kovar?
Oh, yeah. Last question. On the next to last page, I think it was, of the presentation tonight, where it listed the community investment, list. I think it was the page right before the schedule of the budget, if I'm remembering correctly. It listed 8 or 10 different community service investments. I'm not seeing the page now. I'm just seeing the deputy chief here. You know the page I'm talking about?
No, the one that listed.
No, it listed the community investments. It wasn't special revenues. I'm not. Yeah. So if we're talking about the same page, the question was, how many of those listed investments are funded by regular general fund revenues versus coming from different grants and other sources? Because I believe some of them were, and if we can't grab that page right now, I can submit that in writing, because I don't want to hold things up while we do the technology, but it would just be helpful to understand, of those expenditures, how many came from outside, or would be coming from outside grants versus coming from regular on-budget funds. And that's all I have right now.
I just had a couple of other follow-ups. I had one question. I think I caught this correctly, that we are reducing the line item for legal fees. And it was one question I had, given that as we've been talking to the city attorney, the increase in requests, public information requests, seems to be driving some of the increase in legal fees we've had over the last year. So just wanted to know if that was a good idea to like decrease that line item. It's a question, and just thinking that it doesn't seem like we're gonna probably have a decrease in those requests. So that was one thing. I wanted to go back to Councilmember Kovar's question to make sure I understand it correctly. So on the unassigned reserve decrease, so we said that moving from FY 2022, looking at FY 2023, we have a decrease of $2.8 million in the unassigned reserves. Is that correct? Okay, and then we talked about part of that coming from the wage increase, the retroactive wage increase we did in this last year, right? And I think, and this is what I'd like to get double checked, that wage increase plus the bonuses we provided was around $650,000. So I went back to my notes, and so I'm trying to figure out what else was in the 2.8. So in the future, if we could just get a read of the decrease in unassigned reserve decrease of 2.8 million. If a portion of that is the retroactive wage increases and bonuses, what else makes up the 2.8 unassigned reserve decrease? And that can come at a later time. One of the other questions I had related to the reserves is we do have the emergency reserves, and I don't know if this is a question for our finance director, but is it appropriate, as we're thinking about having 17% of in unassigned reserves, to also include in our calculations the emergency reserves, as we're thinking about that? Because my understanding is the emergency reserves are things we tap into when there's an emergency. Same reason we have the unassigned reserve funds. So is there anything that would keep us from saying, okay, if our goal is 17%, and using the money we have in the emergency reserves to count towards that 17%, if you see what I'm saying.
Yeah, I believe the emergency reserve is set up separately from the unassigned reserve. The emergency reserve was set up in the charter that it's specifically for particular emergency purposes, while the unassigned reserve balance can be used for all different purposes, for contracts or for any other projects that we thought that is necessary. So the purpose of the emergency reserve and the unassigned reserve, they are different. I don't know if we can combine it, but technically in the historically, it has been separate. The emergency reserve for one purpose and the unassigned reserve is for all general purposes.
Yeah, and I don't think I'm suggesting we combine them because I'm not suggesting we change our code right now in the middle of budget. But I do know when we did the reserve policy,
Yeah.
since I'm the one who pushed having a reserve policy, that we
Yeah.
also said when we did that, there may be some years that we fall short of our 17%. And as long as the council acknowledges why we don't make the 17% each year, if there are good reasons. And so I'm just thinking, if as we're going through all of this, given the constraints and everything, just, in the emergency reserves, we're going to have probably upwards of almost $600,000 just in our heads, thinking that's also there as a pot of money for emergencies.
Yes, yes. Yeah, we do have a reserve policy set up, and then, and it's mentioned at the end of the reserve policy that we can always reevaluate how much percentage that we need for the city to be kept in the unassigned reserve. But our goal at that time was to set at the 17% of the total general fund revenue. So we chose to use general fund revenue because our general fund revenue is more steady. It's not fluctuating higher or lower like our expenditure. So we want you to use the general fund revenue to have a steady amount of our unassigned reserve.
And I just want to be clear, I'm not suggesting we change that 17% either.
Mayor, can I
Yeah.
ask a follow-up question
Yeah,
on what you just said? One of the written questions that we received, and I don't know, Ms. Chung, if you were responsible for it, but it said with regard to the ARPA reserves, the response from the staff was the ARPA contingency funds, unallocated ARPA funds, around $1 million, I think, could be used to augment general fund reserves if that is the direction of the council. That surprised me because I thought ARPA couldn't be used in that way. So, and
I
I'm
think
sorry, if you jump in.
I believe there is, this is a part of the treasury provision that allow us to do the, what do we call the allowable, huh?
The 10 million standard
yeah.
allowance.
Yes, the $10 million allowable use for the, for general fund use. So this is something that I think our upper manager will be more familiar with that rule. But I know that this is something that the Treasury Department is allowing all our local government to able to tap into the upper fund in case there are usage in the general fund that we can use that allowable amount. And that's $10 million maximum.
Mayor, can I ask just
Yeah,
a quick
yeah,
follow-up
yeah.
on that? Related to the ARPA contingency, is that being figured as part of the total? That's not part of what's being figured as the unassigned balance of
No, that's
the
separate.
17%.
That
Right.
is almost like the ARPA reserve that per se reserve that we will maintain in the ARPA fund. And hopefully by 2026, all our funds, all our projects can be done and completed. And we have remaining balance in the contingency account. So we can transfer that to our unassigned reserve. That is our hope.
Thank you. Great. So I think the last thing is more of a comment, just to check with the city manager. And I just want to thank everyone for the presentations tonight. I appreciate everyone, all the hard work that has gone in and the talk of maintenance of effort budget. But I do think it's important that we also talk about going back to pre-pandemic services. And that is, when we look at this budget compared to, I think Councilman DeBala said this, the last 2 years, it's very hard to compare. Really, this year's budget to the last 2 years because of what we're doing in the rec department, even in our police department, having things like 4th of July or the Folk Festival. That does mean overtime. That means more people working. So I do think it's important that we emphasize that we're returning to things. So as people look at the charts and everything, comparing them to the last 2 years and what we've done, even in terms of conferences and other things, can be not really comparable, given the 2 years before. The other thing that strikes me that I think is important is there are some other differences that we've built into this budget. One is it's an election year, and that it does cost the city money each year for an election. We did increase council salaries. That is the council moving forward. And one of the things we did do also was provide stipends to committees. And so those are, new things that we have put into that are constant things moving forward that show up in this year's budget that have not been in budgets in years before. So I just thought that was good to call out because those are things that do increase our budget this year. And I do appreciate so much the staff working hard to look at savings and everything. And I see Councilmember Smith's light is on.
First, I would like to say I want to thank all senior leadership team coming out this evening to make your proposals. I really appreciate it. First question I have is for Ms. Chung. This year we have a deficit. When was the last time we had a deficit, and why is it this year we're considering the seriousness of this situation? And it just seems like in previous years, it didn't rise to the level that we have to deal with at this time with this council.
It was mentioned in my financial health presentation that the city has been having actual financial deficit for the past few years. The deficit amount is range about maybe from $20,000 to last year is about $954,000 in deficit. And those are the real actual deficit that we have in the past few years. The deficit that you're mentioning now is the budget deficit. Budget deficit is in the budget fund summary, especially in the general fund, that it's showing the revenue amount is lower than the expenditure amount. And that difference is called a deficit, because the deficit amount is what we are either going to draw from the unassigned reserve, or we have to do alternative means to mitigate the deficit by cutting our expenditure or finding ways to raise the revenue. Those are the different ways that we can take care of the budget deficit. So the first step that we did this time is to make sure that we can lower our expenditure. So that's the cost management exercise that we've done right before we present the budget for fiscal year 23.
And Councilmember Smith, I would say to add some color to that, it's so when you look at in Mrs. Director Chung's presentation on the fiscal health over the last 10 years, you looked at 2012, we didn't have a deficit, we had a surplus, and in 2017, I believe it was, we had a surplus. Every other year along that 10 years, we've always had we've been in a deficit position with the budget.
That is correct.
Thank you, Mr. Fox. Thank you, Ms.
Thank
Chang.
you.
So I'm not finished yet. So I know you don't have a crystal ball, right? But you know, if you look at the past, that could inform us on the future, right? So in the last 10 years, 8 of those years we've had a deficit, then we're probably going to have some more deficits, right? Unless council reins in seriously the spending that is happening at the city level, right? So many residents, and I haven't seen a poll, have said they don't want a tax increase, right? So what does that mean? That means the amount of revenues, right, that come into the city will be decreased, right? But unless we have serious reductions in expenditures, we're still going to have this deficit, right? We'll have on one side of the ledger, expenditures way up here, and on the other side, revenue down here, right? So if we don't, as a council, fix this, right, what is going to happen in the future? Can you tell us, what does it mean for services in this city?
Yeah, that is something that we want to avoid, is to reduce the city service because of our deficit. We, as it shown on our financial statement on fiscal year 21, the total unassigned reserve balance is about $7.1 million. This is the actual unassigned reserve balance that we have. But because of the budget deficit that we're experiencing in FY22 and the budget deficit that we have in FY23, that $7.1 million would be decreased due to the deficit. Because once you have budget deficit, the only way is to draw the money from the unassigned reserve. Okay, so we want to avoid our unassigned reserve to be totally depleted. Totally depleted, meaning that we won't have any rainy day fund. So that's why we want to keep our expenditure low, under constraint as much as possible to continuously tapping into our unassigned reserve. So I don't have a crystal ball, but if our deficit continue, like in fiscal year 21, our actual deficit was $954,000, and it's almost $1 million. So we have only $7 million in our unassigned reserve. So it will take about maybe less than 8 years, continuously having a $1 million deficit. It would be completely depleted.
Okay, so this council, if we are going to put our financial house in order, we need to make some serious decisions here, right? So I would like to see, with the direction of Mr. Fox and you and the rest of the staff, we need to have some real options, right? If residents do not want a tax increase, what does that actually mean in services provided to residents in this city? Not theoretically, right? But actually something that people can touch and understand that something's going to get cut, right? That it's not coming back because we can't afford it, right? I don't think that we should come up with, these are my words, gimmicks anymore. Trying to pull money from one account and put it over here to try to make all the accounts align, right? We have to make some serious decisions, and this is the time. So thank you, Ms. Jones.
Thank you.
Councilmember Kovar.
Yeah, so just to be clear, if you don't mind, I appreciate my colleagues' references to these issues. In the audited 2021 budget, we had $3 million in the unassigned reserves over and above the 17%. And according to what you said, the amount that we were out of balance by was a little less than $1 million. So to me, we were not in a deficit as recently as a little over a year ago, right?
The meaning of deficit is a comparison between the revenue and expenditure. Once our revenue is lower than expenditure or expenditure is higher than revenue, that particular year is called a,
Right, but
we will refer
we have
that as
$3 million.
a deficit budget.
We have $3 million in excess.
But those are the capital, the equity account. That is, we are keeping those money in our rainy day fund for the future use in case of any unforeseeable.
Well, but money in the unassigned reserve that is higher than the 17%, that's available for anything, literally. And so if money above the 17% in the unassigned reserve is available and is in it's a general fund, it could be spent on anything. If that exceeds the difference between revenues and expenditures, then I just don't understand why. It may not be good, but I don't understand why why that would be considered a deficit. It's literally not a deficit.
I'd like to clarify, Councilmember Kovar, you're absolutely correct. I don't think Director Chung is suggesting that we keep our unassigned reserve at $7 million every year. We're suggesting that we keep it at just over $4 million every year.
Right.
And currently, what we're proposing, we weren't, even with doing the reductions and the property tax increase, et cetera, we're not able to achieve that. We're proposing a $2.8 million.
That's fine. It's not helpful, though, to have a conversation and say we've been running a deficit for 10 years when literally a year and a half ago we didn't. I just want to say that. We didn't. Right? Objectively speaking, we didn't. We had a surplus. Now, we still have a surplus, but it's
Director Chung's
lower than we
referring
want it
to
be.
the general fund revenues were lower than our expenditures. However, we were able to cover that with our reserves. You're correct.
Which are raised through revenues in the general fund.
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
So I just want to make sure I understand. This is a separate account, right? The account that we're pulling from to make sure that the budget is balanced. It's not in the general fund account, right?
So it is the unassigned reserve is the amount left over in the general fund.
Okay. And
Once
so-
all our expenditures have been made.
Okay, and so is it good practice, I guess I should ask, if you continue to pull money from that account, that extra money, to make sure your budget is balanced?
It's in theory, no. It's not good practice to continue taking from your unassigned reserve. It's there, you can, but it's not sustainable long term. It's no different than most cities will use grants or unassigned to be able to balance your budget. But that's where, whether GFOA or other cities, we talk about deficit budgets because your revenues and expenditures do not match. Now, to get by, yes, you can tap in above what you have there in the unassigned, but by doing so, you're hurting your long-term financial standpoint.
Okay, thank you.
Anyone else? All right. I think we're done for the evening. Thank you, everyone. Thank you to all our senior leadership team for coming out this evening. Thank you to the city manager and the deputy city manager, and we will continue for the next few weeks to talk about the budget. We will be back here. Please don't forget, we are actually having the long-awaited welcome reception for our city manager on Wednesday. Please join us at 6:45 in the atrium, and yeah, and then we'll start our regular meeting at 7:30. So thank you, everyone.